Okay, so first I want to cover a little bit about, I talked a little bit about what we recycle in the United States on my previous slides, and I also covered a little bit about the amount of material in the United States that was recycled. And so a lot of our recyclables are exported, somewhere between 30 and 40%, primarily paper and cardboard, and then secondarily some plastics. And so in 2018, at the beginning of 2018, China imposed some new restrictions on the materials that they were willing to import, and that led to a couple of impacts. So they banned mixed plastics entirely. So a lot of our rigid plastics, these are not the number 1 and 2 bottles. So a lot of the recyclables that were sent overseas as mixed plastics were now not able to go to China anymore. In addition, China imposed very strict quality standards on the cardboard, and they banned mixed paper. So a substantial portion of our cardboard was going to China. We were by no means meeting anything close to the 0.5% contamination standards that they imposed. In fact, industry standard was considered somewhere between 3 and 5% contamination, and chances are we probably weren't even meeting those standards. So we were thinking they would kind of impose something like industry standards, but instead they went significantly below that. And that led to a lot of havoc in the recycling industry. First of all, our ability to comply was really impacted. Secondly, in order to try and improve our methods to comply, we had to do a number of different things. First of all, our MRFs, where they processed the recyclables, had to slow down their lines significantly. Then they added additional labor to try and pull out more of the contamination. And then they started making investments into new equipment. So capital costs going up, operational costs going up, and throughput going down, all while at the same time the price of your commodity has dropped significantly. So this has not been the best year for recycling in the US. And then there's additional pricing pressures that are not necessarily related. So oil pricing for virgin oil, oil is used to make virgin plastics. That has a significant impact on the prices of recyclable plastics. Because the markets are now international, anytime we have a strong dollar, it hurts the U.S. export market. So we actually haven't checked how strong the dollar is, but at the time I made this slide, we had a very strong dollar, and so that was having a negative impact on our ability to recycle. Transportation has had tremendous impacts for us. The U.S. has historically low unemployment right now, and it is very challenging to even hire drivers. And the drivers, to even retain drivers, is a real challenge at this point. And so transportation costs have been going up steadily for the last I think it's closing in on 24 months. This past month was the first time it declined. And then the last thing is contracts. Most of the MRFs, this is where you process the recyclables, most of those facilities are owned by private companies, but yet most of the recyclables that are delivered to them are from municipalities. And the municipalities and the MRFs have contracts that were generally written by the municipalities who like long-term stable contracts. And when I say long-term, some of them were running 15 years, and they were written in good times when the prices were high and going up, and so everybody believes a trend will continue indefinitely, and so they were written with that in mind, and so trying to look at some of those contracts when you're guaranteeing higher and higher rates for the municipalities when all your expenses just went up and your costs went up and your revenues went down is really challenging. So a standard MRF, that's what we call a materials recovery facility in the US. So the material comes in, goes through a series of conveyors. You have magnetic sorters, you have optical sorters, you have eddy current separators, and you have, and so your outputs would be your various commodity streams. Probably the most, paper and fiber is considered one of the best of your commodity streams, and then almost universally despised is glass. So we have a number of issues with recycling in the US. We have issues with contamination. So contamination is identified as anything in your recycling stream that does not belong in there, that was not supposed to be in there. In the US, before we had single stream MRFs, when people had to segregate their recycling into different commodities, it was the public understood that pretty well and they could do a pretty good job. As we started combining things together and more materials were considered acceptable, the public started getting more and more confused. And as they get more confused, they would think, I think it's recyclable, and just throw it in there. And so our contamination rate started creeping up. And right now we're sitting at about 25% contamination. So for every ton of material coming into a MRF, about a quarter of that is just trash. Then we have a problem with rigid plastics. People just assume that all plastics are recyclable. They throw anything and everything in there, and that's causing problems. And that also goes with non-recyclable plastics. And I don't know why my last point isn't up there, but lithium batteries is a huge problem in the US. So more and more of the devices that we use are powered by rechargeable batteries. This is our cell phones, all our electronics, our Bluetooth headsets, even e-cigarettes are all powered by lithium batteries. And a lot of these rechargeable batteries have a nice little recycling symbol on them, which does not mean they can go into our MRFs. They cause fires. They're causing explosions. We have trucks going down the street, catching on fire. We're losing our insurability as an industry, and we are losing on the order of 1% to 2% of our facilities annually from major fires. Here's a picture of the glass, and you can see the glass quality decline. On the left, that's source segregated glass. It looks beautiful. It looks like how the market wants it. On the right, that's how it comes out of our MRFs. The glass generators generally, or glass recyclers don't generally want that, and so it generally requires secondary processing. And yet, this is the quality of glass that's continuing to increase in the United States. And there is glass, from a production perspective, is declining. The primary source of glass use in the United States has been beer, and beer is transitioning more and more into cans, and as a result, the demand for glass has been declining, and so there's not a huge incentive to use higher recycled content in some of those glass bottles. And in fact, anytime somebody tries to pressure the beer industry just says, well, we'll just go to cans because, cans are very recyclable and it would just be cheaper. So the glass manufacturers are not incentivized to really put a lot of pressure on the beer manufacturers to increase the recycled content of their bottles. There's also other pressures among municipalities to demonstrate that they have high recycling rates. So here's, and because I think I told you earlier, recycling in the United States is not governed by any federal law. So it is purely a state-by-state issue, and states count different things as recycling. So when you hear somebody say, we have a very high recycling rate as compared to the rest of the country, you have to make sure they're counting the same things. And so here's an example of some claim that was made by San Francisco a few years ago that they were recycling 80% of all their waste. And that is not an inaccurate statement. except for when you take into account what the denominator is, it includes a lot of things that we generally don't consider as part of the municipal solid waste stream. So it includes a lot of inert materials, a lot of biosolids, and other things that we don't generally include when other cities within the US are doing their recycling. And so in general, the green bar and the black bar combined would be what we would consider MSW. If you consider that, San Francisco would still have a very high recycling rate, somewhere on the order of 50 to 60%, but certainly not 80%. So that's just a way of playing with numbers, and nobody really spends a lot of time examining that. And it's a lot of pressure that's put on various municipalities to really demonstrate that they're doing a really good job recycling. And most people don't then dive into the numbers and say, well, what is the basis for this? There's a lot of things that are, people are talking about influencing the manufacturers on coming up with packaging design for recycling, and that's becoming a much more popular topic even within the US. But there's a lot of pressures on manufacturers to design their products for a variety of different considerations. So here are just a few of the considerations: whether it's freezable, the gas light barrier, how efficiently can it be transported, what the printable surface looks like, the shelf space usage, on down all the way until you get to recyclability design and recycling, recycled content. And in general, those things have not been a very high priority, although with consumer and public pressure, those are probably moving up in order of priority so that manufacturers are taking that into greater consideration than they have in the past. In addition, other changes in packaging and evolution of the waste have been a result of lightweighting that has occurred by manufacturers. So, for example, if you look at something like the aluminum can, which is the bottom row here, in 1972, the aluminum can weighed 20.8 grams, and then by 2009, that had dropped 40% to 13.3 grams. And this is important because when you think about that, you can be collecting the same number of cans, but as far as the public is concerned, you're recycling 40% less. And it costs you the same amount of money to collect those cans because collection is by volume. Recycling is by tonnage. And so you could be doing the exact same job and your recycled rates could be going down. And that's one of the impacts that lightweighting has had. But yet, because lightweighting is done to conserve resources, which is part of the reduce, reuse, recycle philosophy, and it's higher on that order, we still want to encourage the lightweighting, but we will, as people that manage the waste, need to try and convey to the public that we're not doing a worse job just because we're recycling the same number of cans. And even if you're doing a better job, it might still look like you're recycling worse. So then we get into more of the packaging design and the potential impacts. This beautiful picture at the bottom shows how simple things used to be. A bottle was a bottle, a can was a can, newspaper and cardboard were newspaper and cardboard. Now you look at a Starbucks cup and it's a multi-layer material. Most people in the public do not understand that it is not just a paper cup, that it is a paper cup with a plastic lining. They think that you should be able to easily recycle it. And then most people do not understand the middle picture. Those are the layers of like a soup carton or a milk carton. I'm sorry, you know, one of those square ones, a juice box. So those are not just paper, not just plastic, and not just metal, but all three. In fact, they have 6 to 7 layers. So in this case, this one has 6 different layers, and the public wants you to recycle that. The milk shelf-stable milk carton comes with 5 different layers, and the public will demand that that be recycled as well. So the complexity of the material increases, the demand from the public wants you to continue to recycling it, and the manufacturers also want to pressure the industry to recycle more and more of their materials. And then what's down the road, we continue to get additional pressure from manufacturers and the public to take more and more materials into the waste stream. Things like K-cups, things like food pouches, things like chip bags and tubes, none of which has a market. And we have work with the consumers, and we try and explain that without a market, there is no recycling. You need to be able to have some place for things to go. And so this is to close the loop, to have a true circular economy. We support that idea, but to close the loop, we're not the ones closing the loop. Somebody else has to buy it in order for that loop to be closed. So the pressure can't just be on the waste industry, it's got to be on the manufacturers to purchase it and reuse it and figure out a way that they can make that into new materials. So I'm going to change course a little bit and just talk about waste to energy, because a lot of people like waste to energy and promote it strongly. And in the US, most of the environmental NGOs prefer landfilling and recycling over waste to energy. And that is contrary to a lot of other countries and the way their NGOs look at the waste management system. And part of the reason is if you have an infinite number of resources, waste to energy is higher on the hierarchy. But in the US, most of our NGOs recognize that there is a limited number of resources, and when you're protecting the groundwater and the air, landfills do an adequate job and cost significantly less than waste to energy, and then you would have more resources that can be used for those diversion, reuse, and recycling activities. In the US, the number of waste-to-energy facilities has declined over the last 20 years. This is in 2001, we had 97 facilities. As of 2018, we are down to 75. There has only been one waste-to-energy facility constructed in the last 20 years. Most of these were constructed from 1990 and before. And you can also see the total tonnage has declined, although not that significantly. And that's because most of the ones that are closing tend to be the smaller, older ones, and then the bigger ones tend to stay around for a little bit longer. Part of the reason our waste-to-energy facilities are closing are largely because their power purchase agreements are expiring. They generally had very long-term power purchase agreements that lasted 20 years or longer. And as they expire, electricity in the United States has actually dropped in price over the past 20 years. Those power purchase agreements estimated that the price of electricity was going to rise. And so as a result, they aren't able to get similar terms that they were able to enjoy before. And without the ability to sell their electricity at attractive prices, those facilities just cannot economically remain open. Conversely, if you look at Europe, so with approximately a little bit larger population than the US, so we had 75 facilities in the US, they have 488 facilities, and they're treating 93.9 million tons annually. We were treating 92,000 tons per day, so it's about a quarter. So they manage about 4 times the amount of materials through their waste-to-energy process as compared to the U.S. And so clearly there's a lot of different incentives in Europe. They also pay much higher tip fees. I understand, tip fees in the in Europe can be as high as $200, $250. In the US, the most you're going to see anywhere will probably be about $80 a ton. And it could be as low as $18 a ton. And it's a lot more free market in the US. And so waste, if somebody opens a facility and charges $250 a ton, they will not see 1 ton of waste. Organics management is also gaining new attention. You saw that I said that from the first talk this morning that the number one thing that is going into the landfills right now is food waste. And as a result, there's a lot of attention being paid to food waste. So EPA, like they have a waste management hierarchy, also has a food waste management hierarchy. And this is the way it goes. So again, source reduction is the highest priority. Then they've got feed hungry people, feed animals, industrial use, composting, and then they would also include anaerobic digestion and other things like that in the composting, and then finally landfilling and incineration. So once again, on the hierarchy, landfilling is at the bottom of the hierarchy, and there is a lot of efforts being made to try and figure out how to divert it, what can be done. But most of the times, this has to happen before it ever becomes part of the waste stream. So feeding hungry people, that's not going to be happening with our industry. That can't be happening with our industry. Feeding animals is also something that's rarely going to happen in our industry, although that is more frequent. So to feed hungry people, you have to make changes like that are institutional changes. For example, in the US, one of the ways that that's being done is by changing the best buy dates on food. So a lot of foods say that this food expires on this date, but a lot of those dates are arbitrary and unrelated to anything other than the flavor of the food. It does not mean the food is bad for you or bad for anybody, but a lot of people live and die by those dates, and they'll throw that food away simply because it's past its date. So they're making changes, and they're changing the laws so that most food no longer has those dates on. Or they're changing the verbiage on the dates so that people aren't so confused that they think that eating expired food will impact your health. Feeding hungry people, one of our largest members. If anybody's been to Las Vegas, you've probably seen those all-you-can-eat lunches and those buffets. All that food is sent to the landfill, but not to be landfilled or disposed of. There is a hog farm on that landfill, and they do go to feed the pigs. But all that food is separated and kept separate and distinct from the waste. And so there's increased focus on trying to figure out how to solve our food waste problem, but most of it has to happen outside of the waste management structure. So within the waste management structure, though, if we get down to the composting or anaerobic digestion portion, we can manage it low tech, and this is very, for once, being a rural area can be an advantage because you can do composting out in a rural area without huge impacts, and pretty easily you can have a commercial windrow composting operation that people will buy that end product that you're making. You have lots of land, so it's relatively easy to do. In a more urban area, food waste is, of course, the portion of your waste that smells bad. And so invariably, you will have odor issues. I've never been to a food waste management facility that doesn't, at some time or other, have odor issues. So siting it in an urban area is probably not the best idea, but a country with lots of land, there's usually alternative options. And then urban areas, usually anaerobic digestion might be better options for. So having it in a enclosed vessel, being able to get the fuel out of it, and then having some sort of end use for the digestate would be optimal. So let's take a look at costs for some of these different options. So this covers all the different options that we had talked about. This is from the World Bank. So obviously these are very wide estimates. I'm going to try and go through these numbers a little bit for you, so because it's going to be pretty hard to read. So on the far left column, that is the low-income country. Then you have the low-middle-income country, upper-middle-income country, and all the way to the right is your high-income countries. So then below the brown bar, all the costs are in US dollars per ton. Collection, sanitary landfill, open dumping, compost, waste to energy and incineration, and then finally anaerobic digestion. And so the US is, of course, a high-income country, so I'll go to that last column. Collection is actually one of our most expensive propositions. It's $85 to $250 per ton of waste to be collected. And then sanitary landfills between $40 and $100 a ton. Actually, for us, it's a little bit lower than that. $20 to $80 is more like it. There's no cost given for open dumping because most high-income countries do not have any open dumps. Composting is pretty comparable to landfilling, $35 to $90 a ton. And then when you get to waste to energy / incineration, $70 to $200 a ton. And we find that it's actually, for us in the US, it's probably starting at about $80 a ton and going up from there. The last waste to energy facility that was built in the US cost $650 million in capital costs alone. And then finally, the anaerobic digestion, it's $65 to $150 per ton. So these, that range, if you want to drop down, I think Brazil falls under the upper middle income country, but they don't have a price for open dumping. So I'm going to drop down to lower middle income countries to get the price on open dumping. And they say that's between $3 and $10 per ton. And so when something's between $3 and $10 a ton, and the cheapest final disposal alternative for landfilling is $25 to $65 a ton, it's a substantial hike. It's between 2 and 6 times the amount of money. But it's still substantially less expensive than waste to energy, and it still frees up some capital for alternatives and reduction and reuse, and will incentivize some of those practices by having a more expensive disposal option than open dumping. By having a landfill that costs money, recycling itself will increase in number simply because you're trying to save the money from that you would have to spend on your tip fees for the landfill. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, Anne. James.
Let's go talk a little bit about the challenges that we're facing with recycling in the United States right now. Many of you have probably heard about China and the issues that they're having in terms of turning away recyclable materials. There's been a gradual phase-in, well, not necessarily phase-in, but over the past 5 years, they have been looking at more strict criteria for what they will accept for recycling. We've been sending up about 40% of our recyclable materials to China for processing. It was a very mutually beneficial situation because they had the need for that material for their manufacturing process, and we were producing all this, and when they would be sending over all the products to us in these large containers on their ocean-faring boats there, when those containers were shipped back, that's how we would send back all the recyclable materials, the cardboard, the plastics and everything. And so what we've been struggling with has been this curtailing of that market to the point where in another year or so, they're not going to be accepting any new recyclable materials from us at all. We have become so reliant upon them that we are now at this point where we have a recycling crisis in the United States. Part of that is because we have not looked at other markets. Another part of that is because we haven't looked internally. So some of the things that we're looking to do right now is to increase domestic recycling capabilities in the United States. We have more manufacturing going on in the United States right now, so we think that it's a good time to pivot towards that, to getting new facilities online where we can take that material and use it as feedstock for recycling for the manufacturing. So we've been working with other interested parties in the U.S. Some of them are other associations that have members that are not necessarily in the waste and recycling business, but they have an interest in that they would either be producing these materials or they would be using them. So we've put together a coalition of that, and we've been working together in ways in which we can see about whether it's getting tax credits from the government to spur that, or to look for alternative solutions like new markets. We've been meeting with the U.S. Trade Representative's office and with our Commerce Department. They have an international trade agency that we've been working with, trying to find ways in which we can promote these U.S. products in new markets. And we're also looking at ways in which we're looking at the overall infrastructure in the United States right now, where we're talking about roads, airports, bridges, and the like. And we're trying to get this to be part of that conversation where recycling capabilities is a vital part of that infrastructure. And so we've been having some progress with that. Right now, the president is having conversations with the president of China in relation to trade disputes between the U.S. and China. We have been working on those angles as well. Daryl recently sent a letter to the president asking that he make that a priority as he wraps up these negotiations. We do know that there are people in the administration that have heard that message, and that we're hopeful that perhaps that this is something that they can do. It's a real tangible effect that they could actually show progress on trade negotiations with China if they were to do this. So we're just looking at as many different options as we can to try to address this, whether it's reopening China, whether it's looking for new markets, or whether it's doing things domestically. But that would be probably the single biggest takeaway that I would have for you today is look for more than just one customer when you're ramping up your recycling efforts. See what you can be doing domestically, and then also see what other markets are out there that might have a good regional fit for you, that they would be willing to do that, and make sure that you have multiple outlets for that. So, Daryl, did you have anything you'd like to add?
I'll just make a couple quick comments that Jim and Ann didn't mention. And Jim and Ann, by the way, are great professionals, and I really appreciate having them on my staff, and I'm lucky to hear from them today. So I know that your problems are a little bit different than ours. We're at 30-40% recycling, and we're worried about our China markets and things like that. We're also worried about things like big companies coming out with a press release saying, "Oh, we've changed our plastic formulation and it's now recyclable." It doesn't mean anything unless it's getting recycled. So those are the kinds of problems we're having. But I know you're in the initial stages of trying to get people to recycle. So Ann mentioned, and she mentioned it very quickly, that there are no actual federal laws that require us to recycle. Is that better? So there are no laws at the federal level that require recycling. Yet we're recycling 30-40% of our waste. So how can that be? And what would the drivers be for our recycling market? And I wonder if you have any guesses. But one thing, Americans really like to recycle. It's just a thing. And people brag about it. People feel like it's their one chance during the course of a day to do something good for the earth, during the walking through an airport and throwing a plastic bottle into the recycling bin. And this China market thing is just starting to heat up. Congress, the United States Congress, is hearing a lot from industry, but they haven't yet started hearing from the consumers because it hasn't really hit them yet. There are a few cities that have shut down their recycling programs temporarily because we don't have a market for the recycled materials. But, those markets will probably come back. But if it does get worse, there's going to be a big outcry among the American people because they just really like to recycle. It just got into the culture, and back in the 70s when it all started, people just really liked it, and so that's one big driver, is that people ask for it. They call their municipality and complain about it if they don't have it. Some people are willing to pay more to be able to recycle. So that's one driver, and the other driver, of course, is money. Excuse me. We represent private companies, and private companies are in the game to make money. So why are private companies concerned about recycling? Obviously, they can collect these materials just like gold and sell them on the market. So those two drivers are the things that started our recycling programs. There are, rules and regulations at the local level, but those aren't really the things that drive recycling. So when you start thinking about in your country how to start recycling programs, maybe you have some laws for general waste handling, but when you start talking about recycling, I think it's something different, and I don't think the regulatory scheme will help you out necessarily. So, that's all. That's all I have right now. So,
I'm just going to jump back in for a second. I think Daryl said something that kind of struck a chord with me, and that's in terms of really people getting in the habit of doing it. It's really a change of culture. And when it really first started in the U.S., some people did it, but not everybody. We talked before about education and people being educated as far as why to recycle, how to recycle, what the best things are to be recycling, what to recycle. And that's really only the beginning of it, because people need to get into that habit. They need to have that change of culture, the expectation of that this is something that when I'm done with, I'm going to throw it in this instead of that. And to know that I can't be throwing something in if it's if it's garbage, put it in the garbage. If it's something that's clean, that could actually be reused and turned into a new product, then let's do that. So I think we're not there yet ourselves. We've been working on that, and I think that one of the biggest things is that people in the U.S. have gotten to the point where they think that just about everything is recyclable. And while it's good that they want to do that, it's bad in that has led to this increased contamination that's causing these problems now. So again, that's probably another big lesson that can be learned in terms of moving forward with your own program, is just to make sure that that people who want to do the right thing, that they are educated to the point where they know that, okay, this is good to do this, but if I throw this other stuff in it, it's going to just contaminate everything else and make what I thought I was doing a good job with, it's going to make it useless and really roll things back. So the change in culture is something that I can't stress enough.
One other thing is, when you're trying to start recycling markets, I'm a big believer in partnerships of various sorts. We signed a MOU with the Brazilian Trade Association. We sign MOUs with states in the U.S. MOU is a memorandum of understanding. We form government partnerships at our trade association, and I'm just a big believer that instead of trying to force things, using partnerships and looking for unlikely partners is always a very interesting way to get things done. And Ann mentioned that your number one waste stream is food. And that was actually kind of surprising to me. I know that's the case in the U.S., but it's surprising to me in Brazil. But that being the case, that's a good place to start looking for partners. Jim had mentioned that years ago, General Mills formed a partnership with the country and took it upon themselves to start doing educational work in our country. So, taking clues from things like that, food is your biggest waste stream. That's a good place to start recycling. And who are the partners and who are the people that could profit from that? It's probably food companies and the like. So, try to be creative with forming partnerships, and I think you'll get a long way that way. Because what I've heard a lot today is, what can we do with the politics and the regulations and the things like that. That's not necessarily the only place to make big wins. If the waste industry can come together with a different industry group and make some progress, that's always a creative way to think about things.
I think that the pressure that those types of partnerships can put on government, I think is invaluable. That's one of the things that we really focus on in the U.S. is to find ways that we can either get the people involved or we can get important stakeholders involved where the government will sit up and take notice. Because unless somebody is asking them to do something, they're not going to do it. So you really need to kind of have that public pressure or that industry pressure that's on them, that's telling them why they need to be doing this, and that's something that you want and that's important to you. And when elected officials hear that, they'll respond, because that's what they're supposed to be doing. They have been elected to represent you and your interests, and never be shy about making that point that something's important to you.